Before I start, I'd like to thank the member for Stevenage and the member for Southampton and Itchen in the other place for originally preparing this amendment, as well as for the signatories from all parties when this amendment was tabled in the Commons. I'd also like to thank the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of London, who joins me in supporting this amendment, and also to pay tribute to one of our colleagues, the Bishop of Kensington, who's worked very closely on the ground with the victims of Grenfell and leaseholders. Grenfell was an unmitigated tragedy, brought about, it would seem, by institutional failings on multiple levels. The recent revelations that the cladding provider knew that it could result in tragedy and death is, to be honest, nothing short of a disgrace, and has been a tragedy for many lives, ordinary families who've been ripped apart by this terrible event. This fire safety bill will deal with the problem of dangerous cladding by creating a quick and easy mechanism to force freeholders to remove dangerous cladding and other fire safety defects. That's undoubtedly a good thing and will hopefully protect against future tragedies. But as Lord Kennedy has just been saying, I share with him his disappointment that Her Majesty's government has not sought to address the severe adverse financial consequences that this bill will create for leaseholders. In the bill's current form, whenever the fire service serves a notice to the freeholder requiring remedial work to be undertaken, the freeholder will be able to force leaseholders to reimburse all of the costs incurred. These costs are staggering. And at this point, I do want to say, and I'm sure we'd all share, our hearts go out to all the people who are struggling. And I've been absolutely inundated with emails and tweets and other people contacting me who are at their wits' end looking at what's likely to unfold in the next few weeks. Far from the government's estimated remedial costs of around £9,000 per leaseholder, depending on the terms of the lease and the work involved, a leaseholder could very easily be handed a bill of £50,000 payable within weeks. Inside Housing conducted their own private survey of 1,342 leaseholders. Their findings reveal a very different picture to that of Her Majesty's government. Among those surveyed, 63% of respondents faced a total bill above £30,000 for remedial costs, and 15% faced a bill of more than £100,000. Now, of course, a few of these leaseholders may be well off. Some will have disposable income, but most do not. 60% had a household income of less than £50,000, with only 8.7% reporting a household income of more than £100,000. In other words, this will primarily affect ordinary middle to working class people. In addition, 56.4% of those surveyed were first-time buyers. They'd followed that life trajectory that many Conservative governments have sought to promote: working hard, saving, purchasing a property, being people with aspirations, something I totally support. And yet nearly everything they've worked hard towards over many years could be taken away from them, as shown by the alarming 17.2% of respondents who say they're already exploring bankruptcy options. I must remind the House that the costs mentioned above only include the remedial costs. They say nothing about the interim fire safety costs that leaseholders are already incurring. Government figures show the average monthly cost of waking watch in England is estimated at nearly £18,000 per building, and around £330 per dwelling, rising to nearly £20,000 and £500 respectively in London. Not to mention the costs of new alarm systems, raising from £50,000 to £150,000 per block. My lords, how can this be fair? How can this be just? It's not the leaseholders who sold defective cladding. It was not leaseholders who fitted defective cladding. Leaseholders are the innocent party. They purchase their properties in good faith, believing them to be safe. And if this bill passes unamended, it is they who will pay. Not the cladding providers, not the developers, but hard-working ordinary people, forced to pay for defects that were deemed safe when they purchase their apartments. Now, I don't have the technical knowledge about how it fits with this bill and so on, and whether it be better placed in a later bill. What I do know is we're faced with some immediate challenges. Any solution cannot be deferred to the future building safety bill, which could be as far as 2 years in the future. We have to try and do something now. Supporters of this amendment and myself have argued that because this legislation creates the problem for leaseholders, it should likewise solve the problem. Now, I acknowledge there's some weaknesses in this amendment. It doesn't solve every problem for leaseholders. Even if this amendment passes, leaseholders will still shoulder ongoing interim fire safety costs. However, by preventing remedial costs from being passed on to leaseholders, a significant proportion of the financial burden being placed on them should be eased. As one leaseholder said, we need a solution so we can finally move on with our lives, something denied to us now for several years. We just want this nightmare to end. I hope that by passing this amendment, we can begin to end that nightmare and the anxiety plaguing the minds of thousands of leaseholders and allow them to move on. This fire safety bill solves the fire safety defects that lay at the heart of the Grenfell tragedy, and the government is absolutely right to do that, and I'm grateful for what they've done. But I believe they are morally wrong in their treatment of leaseholders in this crisis. By not including sufficient provision to protect leaseholders, a conscious decision would be made to impose poverty, possibly bankruptcy and certainly misery on thousands of ordinary people whose only crime was being aspirational. Those responsible should be the ones who pay. Only the government can provide the capital up front to pay for these works, and only the government can introduce levies on those responsible to claw back that money over the next few years. I believe a great injustice is currently being done to leaseholders, and a fair solution is needed, which is why I bring this amendment to your Lordship's house.
My Lords, I now call Baroness Pinnock to speak to, but not at this point to move, motion C2. Baroness Pinnock.
My Lords, I draw the attention of the House to my relevant interests as a Vice President of the Local Government Association and a member of Kirklees Council. Much has happened since this bill was last debated in this House in November. It is clear from the contributions to this debate already today that this is an unresolved crisis of major proportions. I wish to thank the Noble Lord the Minister for the opportunities he has provided to discuss the issues raised. However, the government's response has been to regard this as largely being one for leaseholders and freeholders to resolve. Gradually, however, the government have acceded the principle that without government intervention and funding, the problem is not going to be resolved. The purpose of both the amendments, or all the amendments, in my name and that of the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Alban, is to extend the principle already agreed by the government. And the amendment in my name, 4F, is to extend the contribution that the government makes is not just to the remediation, but also to cover the service charges, the extortionate service charges, and higher insurance costs that are currently being levied for these leaseholders. This very serious problem can only be successfully fixed with upfront funding from the government, which can then be recouped from developers, from construction firms, and from manufacturers. The government's own estimate is that the total cost of remediation will be in the region of £16 billion. The buildings involved are not just in London, but all across the country. Following the Grenfell tragedy, we know now that ACM cladding was affixed to blocks when it was known to be flammable. As the cladding is peeled away, further serious building defects are revealed. The government recognises this as it has issued a directive to local authorities requiring an inspection of various features, including fire breaks, insulation, spandrel panels, as well as cladding. This is now much more than a cladding scandal. It has become a construction crisis. Worse still is that some of the defects that are being exposed are in breach of building regulations, even at the time of construction. The big question then is who is going to pay? Currently, the government is providing grants for the removal of cladding only and is restricting those grants to buildings of 18 metres or more in height. Yet cladding has to be removed from all blocks, irrespective of height. The government has chosen 18 metres partly because they simply have no idea of how many blocks there are that are lower than 18 metres. I have asked the ministry for the analysis of those risks, to which the minister will refer, but have received no reply to date. Good decision making is dependent on well-researched data and that is then shared for all decision makers. At the heart of this crisis are the people who have done everything right and nothing wrong. They are innocent victims. They have suffered enough. Imagine living in a flat with your family knowing for 3 years or more that the home you saved hard to buy is a significant fire risk. That fact alone has left emotional scars on those leaseholders. Then imagine having carefully budgeted, being faced with an additional service charge of several hundreds of pounds each month to cover the extras, waking watch, insurance, and more. Then, for some, the final straw arrives and you are billed for the costs of total remediation. For individuals, faced with these enormous bills, the choices are very limited. Bankruptcy has already been the solution for too many. George is one such. He describes himself as a frightened leaseholder. He says, "I have been informed it will cost £2 million to replace the cladding and remedy the defects. That's £50,000 per flat. I'll be bankrupt by the end of the year at the age of 28. The building has one grant covering 10% of the costs. Everything they worked and saved for is lost through no fault of theirs. It can lead to homelessness. Sarah lives in a flat in the Royal Quay in Liverpool. In 2021, service charges for that block were £270,000 a year. This year, the service charges are nearly £1 million. The defects are so numerous, the fire service, she says, may have to escalate from a compliance to a prohibition notice. This will shut down the complex. 400 residents will be made homeless if that occurs. Not surprisingly, given those examples, for some, the stress is such that very serious mental illness or worse has followed. Hundreds of thousands of individuals and families are watching and waiting for the decision of this House today. They are willing us on to help find a fair and just solution to a problem that is not in any way of their making. Yet they are the ones who are being asked to pay the price. My lords, if the noble prelate, the Bishop of St Alban, wishes to divide the House, as he has indicated, then the Liberal Democrat benches will fully support him. If, however, he chooses not to do so, then I will wish to test the opinion of the House.
I call the Earl of Lytton.
My Lords, I declare my interest as a Vice President of the LGA and also a practising chartered surveyor. And I have very considerable sympathy with all these amendments. But the matter having now been decided by this House and gone to the other place and come back, it does behove us to consider all these matters with a degree of objectivity, despite the clear emotions that are involved here. With regards to the amendment moved by the noble Lord Kennedy, I agree that it has taken far too long to deal with this matter, and it has allowed the issue to grow in a way that I think should have been nipped in the bud at an earlier stage. But I realise the complexity of the issues, which I will go on to address in a minute. And on all these amendments, I have to say at this juncture, I do not know which way I would vote, and it will become apparent why as I proceed. Now, my lords, it goes without saying that I have the greatest possible respect for the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans, and the powerful case he makes for Amendment C1, and for that matter, by the noble Baroness Lady Pinnock on the allied Amendment C2. And indeed, every fibre of my being tells me that a great injustice has been visited upon many innocent people as leaseholders and tenants in buildings affected by this bill, who are faced with the burdens of past failings, delays and inaction, which they themselves may be powerless to deal with. It must be as if the whole system of property law and ownership has conspired against them. And as a property professional myself, I feel that most acutely. It's been made worse, as I say, by the length of time these problems have been gestating. However, whatever my heart is telling me on the grounds of ethics and justice, my professional experience also tells me that these amendments would almost inevitably not achieve their aims or address the fundamental issues now present, or would become so in the future. This bill potentially affects a very wide category of property and tenure, not just high-rise blocks. The provisions of C1, of Clause 1 of the bill, would extend the regulations to any property comprising 2 or more separate units of accommodation. And I do ask noble lords to contemplate just what that means in practice. To some extent, the measures are retroactive. The Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005 will at a stroke be extended to a large number of properties previously exempted, with application of new responsibilities and duties to those deemed to be in control of them. And within its orbit will fall many factors, known and as yet unknown, some with causes going back many years. This consideration is objectively, of course, a good thing in terms of safety, but will certainly catch many property owners, managers, tenants and long leaseholders unawares due to its retroactive nature. Now, all property ownership carries duties and responsibilities and indeed risks. I have often commented to clients that one of the membership disbenefits of the property-owning democracy is that from time to time one has to incur expense to defend one's interests at net cost. That, I say, is different from the point made about the innocent and not well-funded having to bear totally improbable levels of cost. But although the ghastly trigger for all this is raw in our memories, identifying specific groups as special cases or categories of person who should be absolved from any liability for costs isn't, to my mind, a solution and doesn't take an account of a general need for periodic repair, replacement and remediation common in the built environment. And crucially, it does not move us any closer to the relief of the burdens on the innocent or the attachment of liability to those responsible, even less to the financial expenditure ultimately necessary to solve the problem. It may simply move things to another equally blameless sector, when in fact I believe the need is to contain and address matters where they now arise and not allow this contagion to spread further. So I am far from sure that every potential measure to every property covered by this bill is free from some latent previous work or alteration. And in many ways, everybody here is pleading not guilty. And I mentioned some of the players at report, and I won't repeat that. And the Noble Baroness Lady Pinnock has reminded us of some of that. The amendment seeks to address a specific issue by amending the general operation of laws on liability for costs. And I'm really not sure that works, even less that it is without significant further consequences. Now, my lords, left to my own devices, I might propose something far more radical than this amendment. For instance, the removal of the principle of caveat emptor, so that property sellers might be liable for poor or dangerously sloppy workmanship during their period of stewardship. Of preventing the use of corporate special purpose vehicles to protect large and wealthy development companies from the responsibility for poor construction standards on individual sites, and of ensuring that if the comfort of a construction warranty forms part of what purchaser and mortgagee might reasonably be expected to rely on, that it actually does sit behind the same sort of quality standards reasonably to be expected under the sale of goods and services generally in this country. But my lords, I know that among all the moving parts of the laws of property, construction, contract, regulation, and insurance, civil and criminal liability, fraudulent misrepresentation, and so on, even greater collateral damage could be caused to one of the slickest property markets in the world if we are not extremely careful. So my recommendation would be to follow a route that is clearly within government competence in circumstances of systemic failure in order to provide relief where it is most needed and to stop the contagion. But I have to say, which almost certainly does not lie within this bill. And I have to recognise what the Minister can actually deliver, the degree to which HM Treasury will agree to fund, and what the Commons will agree to in this context. I try not to ask for the impossible, but there are serious problems here, and beyond individual hardship, personal tragedy and dire effects on individual health and well-being, there are also powerful economic arguments for getting this put right. And there I am entirely with the Right Reverend Prelate and the Noble Baroness. We need to think positively and creatively. I think the government is right to stand guarantor and I think should go further in providing the bridging finance for much of what is clearly essential work to alleviate the worst of the problems, thus enabling swift rectification. But rectification depends on available competent labour and capacity in this specialised field. Plus, there are new issues of liability and insurance for anyone now working on cladding. I believe we must review the scope of what is genuinely high risk and perhaps find ways that, whilst not reducing to zero the risks to occupiers, allow for an incremental process of staged remediation and upgrading and take some of the stress out of the current situation. Surely there must be some cheaper alternative to the waking watch in a form that doesn't cost everyone their livelihoods. I used to have to negotiate derogations on fire safety when dealing with old tinderbox listed buildings where the object was to get everyone out to safety via defined and protected selected route, even if the building was a total loss as a result. So dirigiste and risk-averse absolutism is often the enemy of reasonable best practice. But I make this point knowing that at this very moment, part of a huge body of work is in progress in government and among experts, in which the Minister, I know, has a direct hand. We certainly cannot wait for the legal and judicial processes to establish liability before remedying this situation. There are far too many moving parts, as I've already observed, and things could simply grind on for years. But longer term, maybe we do need another Law of Property Act, but it might have such far-reaching implications that I merely park the point at this juncture. Whatever one does in the context of this bill, it has consequence in several other areas. So whilst I am hugely sympathetic to these amendments, I am forced to conclude that they may not actually achieve what is necessary. They're not the fix that is required in my own view. And what is a moving and evolving situation with some crucial areas clouded in uncertainty. But I will listen carefully to what the noble Lord the Minister has to say. But the government, I do say this, it needs to be on the front foot here, because these amendments seek to address part of a huge problem that is not going away and must be addressed. Thank you.
The following members present in the chamber have indicated that they wish to speak: Lord Newby, Baroness Warwick of Undercliff, the Bishop of London and Lord Adonis, and I will call them in that order. So the first speaker will be Lord Newby.
Begin by declaring an interest. I'm a leaseholder in a block where I stay when I'm in London during the week, which has been found to have major safety defects and in which a waking watch is now in operation. So I've been able to see in my own bills, but also by talking to people who live in the block, what the consequences of the current situation really are. I strongly support the amendments in the name of the Lord Bishop of St Albans and that of my noble friend Baroness Pinnock. My lords, this is a scandal of major proportions, and it's a modern scandal. Most of the buildings we're talking about have been built in recent years. We're not talking about a leftover problem from the Victorians or the Edwardians. This is a recent problem of our own times. And it's one which, as we've heard, is causing great distress, not minor worries, to a very large number of people. Because the scale of the financial consequences of the problems they face affects not just their short-term economic position, but every aspect of their lives. The immediate costs in themselves are pretty horrendous for people on modest incomes. And in my block, as elsewhere, people in that position are having to take out loans at very high rates of interest in order to deal even with the ongoing waking watch costs, which are very considerable. But people are then, beyond that, stuck. They can't sell their flat. They can't move, even if there were compelling reasons for them to do so. And in some cases, they feel unable to start a family as they planned because of the overwhelming financial uncertainties they face. And none of this, as is obviously the case, is their fault at all. The Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Alban's amendment deals with the core of the problem and would remove from them the cloud of the future financial burdens they face, and I strongly support it. It doesn't, for reasons which I fully understand, deal with the question about who ultimately should pay for all this. In my mind, that's pretty straightforward. The principal burden should fall on those who are culpable, the developers. They have made very significant profits over very many years building substandard accommodation, and they should pay for it. In the case of Barratt Developments, who built the block in which I live, their profits over the past 5 years alone have been over £3.5 billion. They can afford to clean up their own mess, and the same applies to other major house builders. Exactly how that's done, I admit, is complicated, but this is a challenge for the government which they have not begun to meet. My Lord, in the lockdown, television channels are showing old series because it's been so difficult to make new ones. And last night, I watched an old episode of Yes Minister, which I strongly recommend. And it's clear that the Minister watched it as well, because he has used exactly the arguments which Sir Humphrey used to persuade the minister not to take action. It's highly complex. I'm really sorry, we'd love to do it, but it's really quite difficult, you know. And of course, even if we could do it, which we can't, it's not appropriate to do it in this bill. It will, of course, possibly, if we can do it, and I'm not sure we can, it may be possible to do it in a future bill. Not sure which bill, don't know when it's going to come, but because it's very complicated, you won't expect me to say further. That is the Minister's response to this. In last night's Yes Minister, what happened was that the Minister, completely frustrated by these usual arguments, put his foot down by announcing on national television that something was going to be done, which in effect bounced his permanent secretary into doing something. Can I suggest that the noble Lord the Minister takes a leaf out of the Minister's book and goes on television this very evening and says he's been so impressed by the debate that he's heard that the government will now act speedily. My Lords, the truth is that the reason that we're hanging about has everything to do with a lack of political will and not to do with the technicalities. It's the job of government to deal with difficult things. Most bits of public policy are tricky and difficult. This is no exception, but it doesn't mean that government doesn't have any policies on anything. It means it chooses what it wants to devote time and effort to, and it's decided it's not prepared to put in the time and effort and commitment and funds to deal with this glaring injustice. My Lords, the Right Reverend Prelate's amendment is a start because it removes the cloud or the major part of the cloud facing people currently in difficulty, and it should be supported. But even when it has been supported, it doesn't absolve the government of really grappling with this issue and sorting it out properly.
The next speaker, Baroness Warwick of Undercliff.
Lords, I declare an interest as Chair of the National Housing Federation, the representative body for housing associations in England. Our members house 6 million people in 2.6 million homes, including a significant number of flats in multi-storey, multi-occupied buildings that need remedial work in their external wall system. Nothing is a greater priority to housing associations and their residents' safety. And following the awful Grenfell tragedy, they have been leading the way in the past 3 years, identifying buildings that need urgent work and carrying it out as quickly as possible. My Lords, in his Amendment C1, the Bishop of St Alban wants to protect leaseholders from huge bills to make their homes safe, and I support him. Leaseholders should not be facing such costs. Other noble lords have given vivid examples of the impact on leaseholders. Housing associations are doing what they can to ensure their leaseholders don't have to foot the bill for developers' mistakes by pursuing the companies that built the buildings, as well as warranty and insurance providers. But sadly, my Lords, these efforts are not always successful, and so I applaud a move by this House to provide extra assurance to leaseholders living in these homes. But, my Lords, housing associations face a huge dilemma. They exist predominantly to provide social homes to those on lower incomes. The buildings that housing associations need to remediate due to safety concerns will largely be made up of social housing. This welcome move to protect leaseholders must also be coupled with further government funding to pay for the necessary remedial works to all the buildings that need them. While the funding that government has made available already for remediation costs so far is very welcome, the £1 billion Building Safety Fund and the additional £3.5 billion announced last month are not available to remediate homes in which social tenants live. Housing associations don't make profits to draw from, so any costs that they incur will generally be met using income from tenants' rents, as well as money that could otherwise be spent on improvements to tenants' homes and communities. This would mean that without additional funding, this amendment could result in charitable housing associations paying for works to both leaseholders and social tenants' homes, effectively subsidising leaseholders' share of remedial works costs with the money social tenants pay for the upkeep of their homes and communities. Building remediation could cost the housing association sector upwards of £10 billion in total. Of course, I don't want to see leaseholders picking up large bills for this reason, but I do want to see government funding to pay for leaseholders' share of all works in all buildings to protect housing association renters from effectively picking up the bill. Importantly, housing associations also use their funds to build affordable housing. Paying for urgent remedial works for people's homes must be and is the sector's top priority. But this essential work means that fewer affordable homes will be built in the future at a time of desperate need. Research shows that we need 90,000 new social homes every year to meet demand in our country. The G15, a group of London's largest housing associations, worked out that they have in aggregate spent in the last year, expect to spend next year, or have included in their business plans up to 2031, a total of £2.9 billion. They estimate that as a result of this spend, they will build 72,000 fewer affordable homes to rent as they continue to prioritise these essential safety works. In addition to this, many of these housing associations will have to defer planned maintenance works and upgrades beyond those required to maintain decent homes compliance. And that group are just 13 housing associations from a raft of hundreds of organisations that provide affordable homes. That's why legislating for building owners to cover remediation costs doesn't have the intended effect in all cases. In the case of social providers, they are facing astronomical costs for buildings they didn't construct in the first place. My Lords, we are right to seek protection for leaseholders, but that must sit alongside government building funding to remediate all buildings in need, including social housing. Otherwise, tenants and people who need social housing will suffer needlessly now and for years to come. As the noble prelate said, the government is the only agency that can do this, and I hope that the Minister will today confirm that the government will provide upfront funding for all remedial works and recoup the cost to the taxpayer by establishing liabilities later.
Bishop of London.
My Lords, I wish to support the amendments in the name of my friends, the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans and the Noble Baroness Pinnock, which provide a more comprehensive solution than is already in this bill. As the 133rd Bishop of London, it has been my privilege to serve this city for the last 3 years. My Lords, unfortunately, I have seen how inequality of outcome is built into our city. And as I have followed this debate, it has moved me to speak today. It is almost 4 years since the Grenfell Tower disaster. Hundreds of thousands of citizens in London, but also in other cities across this country, still lie awake at night, wondering if their homes are safe and if they can weather the financial hardship of life, of the life-changing remediation bills that they face. This is having a major impact on the health and well-being of our communities, of the communities in this city. My work on the ground with the Bishop of Kensington has meant that I engage with people who are bearing the real cost of this, not just cost financially, but to their health and to their mental well-being, some facing suicidal thoughts. And of course, whilst they may bear the cost today, they will bear the cost in the future, and there is no doubt that the NHS will bear the cost in the years to come. We've heard from the government, and we have heard of substantial sums of money which have been quoted, but I fear that this doesn't really go far enough. The Bishop of St Albans and Baroness Pinnock's amendment exist because each month people edge closer to bankruptcy and struggle to sell their properties with debts attached from the exorbitant remediation and interim fire safety costs. Due to these financial pressures, some will pay almost 60% of their annual salary on these costs. The government's current approach, that of a levy on developers, has some weaknesses. If the scope of the levy was extended to cover other responsible parties, such as major contractors and suppliers of defective products, greater sums could be raised. The noble Lord's amendments attempt to distribute responsibility fairly. because it is a shared responsibility of the developers community, testing and regulatory guidance communities, and major contractors to ensure that those who brought their homes in good faith and understood them to be safe, be they high or low rise, do not face the burden of cost to refit their properties and make them safe. It is our responsibility as representatives of your Lordship's House to make sure that we do right by the people of this country, even if it is complex. That is the role of government. The Church of England is quite clear. In a recently published Archbishop's Housing Commission report, we recommended that the government should cover remediation costs and recoup its initial outlays from those responsible. We are looking to the government to develop a simple, fair and comprehensive solution to the current crisis. But this solution must be clear and it must be cost-effective, but it also must be quick. Any solution should be based on polluter pays principles, with those responsible for unsafe buildings being required to put them right. Therefore, I would want to press the noble Lord the Minister and ask for assurances that the government will implement a comprehensive solution to ensure leaseholders living in blocks over 18 metres high and blocks between 11 and 18 metres do not pay for any remediation or interim fire safety costs through the Building Safety Bill, and will be compensated for their losses so far. Secondly, I'd want to press the noble Lord, the Minister, to improve the government's current approach that consists of a levy on developers and distribute the responsibility of these costs as far as possible to all of those responsible for the current crisis, and so protect leaseholders and taxpayers. And finally, to create a legacy for the future of buildings and houses that are fit for purpose for those in our community and in a UK post-COVID. And if these commitments cannot be given today, will the Minister meet me and representatives of the Archbishop's Housing Commission to discuss how we can take forward these solutions in the coming Building Safety Bill? But, my Lords, I support the amendments in the name of the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Alban, and my noble friend, Baroness Pinnock. Thank you.
I'd like to call the next speaker, Lord Adonis.
My Lords, the most important work this House does is to legislate, and within that work, the most important work it does is to assert its view and opinion against the government and the other House, because that's where we're acting independently as opposed to simply acting as either a rubber stamp or a deliberative assembly. And it always amazes me, my Lords, how little time and attention we spend on our most important function. Many noble lords are in committee until 11 o'clock at night, midnight, day after day, discussing amendments the first time, and then we refine them for report the second time, and we may come round to them at third reading. But when it comes to the most controversial issues in a bill, which by definition are those which we send to the other place, we're expected to hurry them all through. Very inadequate notice is given of matters coming back to this House. There isn't proper structured arrangements for the discussion in the way that there is for the ordinary consideration of legislation. We're faced with reasons on hugely weighty issues from the House of Commons as to why they won't accept our view, which usually consists of 1 or 2 lines of the most utmost banality, statements like, because the government has announced that it intends to bring forward its own legislative proposals. Full stop. That is supposed to be a reason why hours of deliberation by this House and votes, we are supposed to set all of that aside and simply accept a government assurance. And, my Lords, we're also always put under great time pressure. And then the Salisbury Convention is brought in as to why this House, which has spent hours and had many votes on these issues, shouldn't even spend the proper time and consideration required, including using our undoubted powers, which are to continue to ask the House of Commons to consider these matters again. Other legislatures, my Lords, which have 2 chambers, deal with these matters much better. They have arrangements for joint sittings on issues which are contested between the Houses, which I believe we should have. It's only because historical reasons to do with the Middle Ages. I mean, one of the Right Reverend Prelate's 133 predecessors probably devised these arrangements in the 13th century, my lords, even before Yes Minister. But they are absolutely not fit for purpose in the 21st century. We inhabit the same building. We have electronic means of communications. We can consider these matters better. And by definition, as I say, my lords, when we come to this stage of a bill, these are always weighty and substantial matters, or else we wouldn't be engaging in them for the second and third time in a conflict with the House of Commons. And these are really hugely important issues. When the noble old Lord Lytton said that we needed to be objective rather than emotional, my lords, the objective thing to be on this issue is emotional, because we're dealing with people who are facing, as the two Right Reverend Prelates said, and the noble Lord Newby, potential bills of 40, 50, £60,000 apiece that will drive them into bankruptcy, cause them huge mental anguish. In some cases, let's be frank about this, my lords, because we've all heard of stories of this. Suicide, because these are absolutely catastrophic impacts on individuals. And we, as legislators, have a duty to take account of that and to reach the best possible arrangement we can be. And I do stress, my lords, we should not be railroaded on issues of this kind into having to either cave in or take quick decisions before there has been proper consideration. And when the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of London, said, as she did just now, that the Archbishop's Council, and I know the Archbishop of Canterbury has been leading with a number of extremely distinguished experts on housing work on this issue and would like to meet with the Minister, I would have thought the very least that the Minister can say in response to the Right Reverend Prelate is that assuming that this amendment does go back, before it comes back to this House again, he and the Secretary of State will meet with the Right Reverend Prelate and the Archbishop of Canterbury and their advisers, who I happen to know include a former Permanent Secretary and other very senior and expert people on this matter, will meet with them to discuss these issues, because these are matters of huge anguish and importance. And it's very important that we play fair by people who, as everyone has accepted, are facing not big charges which were expected, or which, as the Noble Earl said, the noble old Lord Lytton said in respect of property, that you have duties, responsibilities and risks. These are not normal risks. People should be expected to bear normal and reasonably foreseeable risks. These are completely abnormal risks of a scale they couldn't either have been expected to foresee or to budget for. And are also having other consequences which haven't even been mentioned in the debate so far. This is leading to a very substantial seizure of the entire property market at the moment. When large numbers of people with leasehold properties simply cannot sell them at the moment, because until these risks are properly quantified and the allocation of the burdens is properly determined, people can't sell. It's a huge problem in the property market at the moment, and this will continue until it's done. And when the noble Lord Minister, for whom we have great respect, and he knows these matters at first hand, he's the former leader of a local authority with large numbers of leaseholders, said that the government was seeking to crunch through them time bit by bit and deal with them. My lords, I should say, and this goes straight back to Yes Minister again, the Grenfell Tower fire was on the 14th of June 2017. The 14th of June 2017, that is by my calculation 3 years and 9 months ago. We're not exactly rushing with indecent haste to deal with these issues. It is perfectly reasonable to expect that the government should do its job, which is to safeguard the community on matters of huge public importance, including putting schemes in place. My lords, it took 20 years to build the Great Wall of China, and we're saying that after 4 years, the government still doesn't have a proper scheme in place to deal with these issues. So I strongly urge the House to agree both to my noble friend's amendment and to the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Alban's amendment, partly because they are correct, but also because these are huge issues which will, of necessity, will require further elucidation and debate. There are issues. The Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans, did something which politicians in this House very rarely do, which is he admitted his amendment wasn't perfect. He himself pointed up one or two of the defects. That's a very unusual procedure in the House to do that. But what's needed now is a further process of deliberation, because the costs involved here and the impacts on individuals are huge. We've had figures. They're not even agreed, the figures. It would be quite good if the difference between the £9,000 which the government has said is the average cost estimate for remedial work, and the £50,000 which the Right Reverend Prelate said. There's quite a big difference between those two figures. £41,000 is about 1.5 times the average wage for a year in this country. If we had some of those matters agreed, and a proper scheme. And I certainly don't think we should be railroaded into closing this matter down today. We should send these amendments back to the House of Commons so that this gives an opportunity, and I hope an opportunity of some reasonable length, not just another ping-pong taking place later this week or next week, to consider these issues and a scheme to be brought back. On the substantive points at stake, my lords, could I just make a few comments? The Minister circulated a letter this morning. Again, it came at the last minute. I was only able to read it literally before coming into the chamber. The letter said, in response to my noble friend Lord Kennedy's amendment, that the government would publish responses. It said three things. Firstly, the government would publish responses to the fire safety consultation. It said it had done it today, but I couldn't find in the printed papers the response. And it said it would also publish regulations to deliver on the Grenfell Tower inquiry's recommendations and would indicate where further legislation would be forthcoming. Now, to those of us who aren't encyclopedic experts on what's going on with the Grenfell Tower inquiry and the matters at stake, it isn't clear what the government is saying. And in particular, if I could press the Minister, my noble friend Lord Kennedy's amendment proposes in 2B, subsection 1, that within 90 days, the Secretary of State must publish draft legislation requiring owners and managers of buildings to A, share information with their local fire and rescue service in respect of each building, B, undertake annual inspections, C, undertake monthly monitoring inspections of lifts, and D, share evacuation and safety instructions with residents of the buildings. All things I would have thought noble lords would think are absolutely reasonable and essential. So can the Minister tell us, in the responses to the fire safety consultation and the regulations to deliver on the inquirer's recommendations that they're publishing today, are my noble friend's points met, point by point? Are those 4 points met? Because I think that's a crucial issue for us in deciding where we proceed next in respect of the my noble friend Lord Kennedy's amendment. And on the issue to do with remediation costs, the crucial point, it seems to me, is the Right Reverend Bishop of St Alban's proposed new clause 4F, which is that the Secretary of State must design and implement a scheme to deal with the issue of the costs, including but not limited to building owners, freeholders or developers. So, my lords, the question to ask the Minister, if he could say at the end, which is crucial to how we decide to proceed on this, both in the vote at the end of this debate, but also what happens hereafter, is what are the government's intentions in respect of designing and implementing a scheme? And in particular, taking up the point of the noble Lord Newby, both about the scale of the costs, but also the absolutely correct liability to which developers should be held. It is obviously the case, my lords, that developers like Barrett's, who have armies of lawyers and the capacity to see off little people, which is most people, actually, when it comes to the likes of Barrett's, if they're having to deal with Her Majesty's government in respect of their liabilities, and a minister of the calibre of Lord Greenhalgh, who turns up on their doorstep and says that they are going to be expected to shoulder these costs as per a scheme which has been designed by the government and is being pushed forward by the government, I can assure your lordships that this will lead to a much, much bigger result than if it's all being left to individual leaseholders and individual freeholders. So if the Minister could say then, what is the government actually intending to do? Is its intention to stand by and leave these hundreds of thousands of leaseholders at the mercy of individual negotiations and freeholders? Or will it move with a government-led and nationally driven scheme to recover these costs, wherever that's possible, from, as Lord Newby so rightly said, developers who have made an absolute killing, so it's not the right word and appropriate you are choosing this context, have made a fortune, my lords, a fortune on developments with returns which they often themselves expect to be of the order of 20, 25 and 30% in making these in taking forward these developments. And it is perfectly reasonable, as fire safety regulations are shown to have been not properly enforced in substandard cladding, that they should be held accountable for them, and it is the government on behalf of the people at large who should be holding them accountable. And before we pass this legislation into law, my lords, we should be assured that the government has a proper, viable and effective plan to bring that about.
My lords, is there anyone present in the chamber who has been here since the beginning of the debate who would wish to contribute? No, in which case I then revert to the Minister, Lord Greenhalgh.
My Lords, I have listened carefully to the debate and will take this opportunity to address your comments and concerns in more detail. I will start by addressing Amendment 2B. I thank the Noble Lord Kennedy of Southwark again for his constructive engagement with me on this issue, and I wish to reiterate again that this government remains steadfast in its commitment to deliver the Grenfell Tower Inquiry Phase 1 report's recommendations in full. It is understandable that this House wants to see visible progress on delivering the inquiry's recommendations and to have a better understanding of timing on next steps and on the proposals we will bring forward. Today, the government published its response to the fire safety consultation, and this important consultation is a clear demonstration of our progression towards implementing the inquiry's recommendations. My Lords, I am clear that this government intends to subject to the fire safety bill gaining royal assent, lay regulations before the second anniversary of the Grenfell Tower Inquiry Phase 1 report, which will deliver on the inquiry's recommendations. These will include measures around checking the fire doors and lifts. I'm also committed to seeking further views as soon as practicable through a further public consultation on the complex issue of personal emergency evacuation plans. My Lords, we already know that some of our proposals from the consultation will require primary legislation. These include strengthening the effective guidance relating to the discharge of duties under the fire safety order, for responsible persons in all regulated premises to record who they are and to provide a UK-based address. We intend to include these measures and possibly others that come out of the consultation to strengthen fire safety in the Building Safety Bill, which will be introduced after the Government has considered the recommendations made by the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee and when parliamentary time allows. I thank the Noble Lord for hopefully not pressing this matter to a vote. He is right in his role to hold the Government to account for delivering on the Grenfell recommendations, and I'm pleased to have provided the reassurance he was seeking. I thank the Noble Baroness Pinnock again for not pressing Amendment 3. I understand her interest in this area. More generally, we are looking at specific information sharing provisions in the regulations and later in the Building Safety Bill that we see as a first step to meeting the Grenfell recommendations on this issue. In response to the Noble Lord Kennedy, the other reason for resisting the Public Register amendment is that anyone from the general public will be able to access fire safety information about a building, which poses a security risk in the event that that information were to be accessed by someone with malicious or criminal intent. But the Government does agree with the principle that residents are able to access critical fire safety information for the building they live in. And through the fire safety consultation, we do include proposals for this to happen. My Lords, I will now turn to address amendments 4B to 4F. First, I want to reiterate the intention conveyed in the other place that we share the concerns around the costs of remediation and the need to give leaseholders peace of mind and financial certainty. I've always been clear that all residents deserve to be and feel safe in their homes. My Right Honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, has committed to taking decisive action to deal with the cladding crisis and for all through the Government's 5-point plan to provide reassurance to homeowners and build confidence in the housing market. Firstly, the Government will be providing, as been commented on, an additional £3.5 billion to fund the removal and replacement of unsafe cladding on residential buildings. This will be targeted at the highest risk buildings, those buildings over 6 stories or above 18 metres that have unsafe cladding. This is in line with long-standing expert advice on which buildings are at the highest risk, and this brings the government's investment in building safety to an unprecedented £5 billion or more. Secondly, we have been clear that leaseholders in lower-rise buildings with a lower risk to safety will gain new protection from the costs of cladding removal through a long-term, low-interest government-backed financing scheme. Leaseholders in a residential building which is 11 to 18 metres in height with unsafe cladding will never pay more than £50 per month towards this remediation. My Lords, it is important that this government funding does not excuse building owners of their responsibility to ensure that buildings are safe. We have been clear that building owners and industry should make buildings safe without passing on costs to leaseholders. They should consider all routes to meet costs, for example through warranties, and recovering costs from contractors for incorrect or poor work. As the Minister for Building Safety and Fire Safety, I will ensure that we drive forward to ensure remediation of unsafe cladding is completed, and I am clear that we have an ambitious timescale to do so. No doubt, in response to the Lord Kennedy, progress has been not as fast as we would have liked, but we are making great progress, particularly given the constraints this year of the pandemic, and around 95% of high-rise buildings with Grenfell-type ACM cladding identified at the start of 2020 have completed remediation or have works on site to do so by the end of the year. I want to be clear that whilst this issue is vital, it would be impractical and confusing to include remediation measures in the Fire Safety Bill. This is because the Fire Safety Order is a regulatory framework that sets out the duties of a responsible person in relation to fire risk assessments. It does not cover the relationship, including potential financial obligations or prohibitions between freeholder and leaseholder. This bill is so important because it allows for effective enforcement where responsible persons are not abiding by their responsibilities. It addresses the situation where responsible persons are refusing to remediate, which is an issue I'm sure that the whole House wants resolved as soon as possible. In contrast, the Building Safety Bill is the appropriate legislative mechanism for addressing the issue of who pays for remediation. Through the Building Safety Bill, the Government will strengthen the whole regulatory system for building safety, as well as ensuring there is greater accountability and responsibility for fire and structural safety issues throughout the life cycle of buildings within the scope of a more stringent regime. That bill's provision will put the management of risk front and centre, and it is important that remediation is addressed using its proactive mechanisms for managing fire and structural safety issues, such as the safety case. Remediation and costs to leaseholders should be dealt with in this context, rather than within the Fire Safety Bill, to ensure legislation is coherent with the aims and scope of the new regime. In response to the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Alban, I would point specifically to the draft Building Safety Bill and clauses 88 and 89, which relates to charges. These clauses facilitate regulations which amend the Building Safety Act and the Landlord and Tenants Act, and we will be adding to what is in the draft bill already, including additional duties on the accountable person to seek alternative funding before they pass costs on to leaseholders. Whilst I can appreciate the desire that many noble lords have for a quick legislative solution to the who pays issue, we also have a duty as parliamentarians to implement a clear framework and transparent legislation to support fire and building safety reforms. Even more than this, it is important to ensure that the practical implications of any legislation are properly worked through, rather than being rushed in this bill or onto the statute book. In this vein, I'm clear that these alternative amendments do not work. I would like to thank the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans, for his amendment in lieu. However, it does not take into account remedial works that arise outside of the fire risk assessment process. For example, costs identified as a result of a fire or building works taking place. In such cases, this will not prevent costs being passed on. Further, the amendment is not sufficiently detailed and would require extensive drafting of primary legislation, thereby delaying the implementation of the Fire Safety Bill and the crucial measures it puts forward to improve the fire safety regulatory system. If this amendment were to be added to the bill and became law without the necessary redrafting, the government and taxpayers might be exposed to protracted action by building owners in the courts. Building owners could use litigation to claim for costs they feel they are entitled to pursue from leaseholders under the terms of a lease agreement. While the litigation is ongoing alongside disputes over where costs should be, there would also be delays to construction work to carry out urgent remediation and possibly interim safety measures. I also thank the noble Baroness Lady Pinnock for her amendment in lieu. However, as with the amendment from the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Alban's, there are concerns that it would fail to achieve the intention of prohibiting costs being passed on. By trying to prohibit the passing of remediation costs through service charges, there are significant legal risks, including an increased risk of facing legal action from landlords without the sufficiently robust legislative detail to override possible conflicts with the terms of existing lease agreements. This and the need for extensive drafting of all primary legislation is likely to result in delays, and defects identified outside a fire risk assessment will continue to be passed to leaseholders. Moreover, this amendment may be too narrow in its scope by focusing on service charges as the primary site to prohibit remediation costs from landlords. Costs from landlords may find other ways to pass remediation costs onto leaseholders, for instance through additional or exceptional fees and charges, which they may be allowed to pass on to leaseholders under the terms of existing lease arrangements. As such, this amendment has laudable intentions. However, it is unlikely to generate beneficial outcomes for leaseholders. My Lords, I have touched on legal problems that could arise from both of the alternative amendments on remediation. I'd like to reiterate the complexity around remediation costs, which I believe supports the case for this not being the right bill to consider these concerns. As mentioned in my specific points concerning the amendments from the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Alban's, there are concerns about contractual disputes and potential litigation impacting the government, the taxpayer and leaseholders. By stating in legislation what the landlord can and cannot recover from the leaseholders, it could contradict the provisions set out in the contractual terms of a lease. As a result, it would be unclear where the costs should lie, rather than being determined by the terms of the lease. Furthermore, these amendments do not reflect the complexity involved in apportioning liability for remedial defects. There are a range of views as to how costs should be distributed among leaseholders, freeholders, developers, construction industry, contractors and other parties. It would be remiss to introduce legislation which places liability firmly on the landlord without adequate discussion of where the costs should lie or how they should be dispersed. And so in response to the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Alban's and the noble Baroness Pinnock, and indeed the noble Lord Newby and the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of London, we have announced measures with greater nuance concerning the distribution of costs. And this approach combines government funding, repayments from leaseholders and contributions from developers and industry through an upcoming tax and levy. While the merits of this approach can be discussed separately, I think one thing we can agree is that the simplistic approach of passing these orphan liabilities entirely to landlords in spite of the terms of existing lease agreements is not the right manner in which to proceed. Not only would the decision to pass all these costs to the building owner be overtly simplistic, it could also be counterproductive. It would be self-defeating if residents who have paid a small amount to collect ground rent, if landlords who have paid a small amount to collect ground rents from flats, when faced with remediation bills of this side, decide simply to walk away. Many freeholds are held in special purpose vehicles to limit the liability held by individuals involved, and in these cases they could simply activate an insolvency procedure to avoid the debt. This also highlights the lack of robust detail in this amendment, as it contains no due consideration of what would happen to the liabilities at this point. If these owners walked away it would leave leaseholders in the same position, continuing to live in unsafe properties and with no further clarity as to where these costs should lie or who is responsible to pay. Working through these types of issues in a proper way will require much more extensive drafting of primary legislation. We must avoid a situation where we encourage an escalating quantity of contractual disputes and litigation from landlords who feel the legislation runs counter to their rights and liabilities as laid out in existing lease agreements. My Lords, I would agree, however, with the Noble Earl Lytton that we do need to look at radical ways of improving the recourse to redress and improve the redress mechanisms. And I thank him for his contribution in this debate. I also would offer to the Noble Baroness Lady Pinnock to find out more about the building that's occupied by George and to see whether we can help that building access the available funds such as the Waking Watch Relief Scheme and the Building Safety Fund to help support the funding of remediation costs. And also note the problems highlighted by the Noble Baroness Lady Pinnock about the resident Sarah, who I believe is in Royal Keys. And I would state that we're aware of this development and the difficulties it faces, and sympathise a great deal with the problems raised. And we're working alongside Liverpool City Council to ensure that we are doing what we can to support the building, and this includes considering eligibility for public funding. I'd also point out to the Noble Baroness Lady Warwick of Undercliff that if housing authorities are in a position where they may have to pass on costs to leaseholders, then they are able to apply to the Building Safety Fund. So in that way, the leaseholders in housing associations have the same access to funding and will be protected in the same way as those in private housing. And I am happy to agree to meet with the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of London, and any of the members of the Archbishop's Housing Commission that would want to discuss these issues in greater detail. Let me be clear, it is unacceptable for leaseholders to have to worry about the cost of fixing historic building safety defects in these buildings. These are recent issues, but they are issues that not just in the last 10 years, but in the last 20 or 25 years. It's not just something that has cropped up in the last couple of years. This is a generational problem in many ways. However, I would ask Noble Lords to recognise that while these amendments are based on good intentions, they are not the appropriate means to solve these complex problems. And in invoking the name of yes, Minister, yes, we need political will, but we also need a political brain to recognise these are problems that are not going to be solved by a simplistic intervention, by orphaning liability or assigning liability to a freeholder that can then subsequently walk away from playing any part in helping to remediate the costs that are facing the building to make it safe. So for practical reasons, that these amendments are likely to be ineffective and may even make the situation worse for some leaseholders. Litigation arising from disputes over what landlords can and can't recover from leaseholders, where legislation runs contrary to the provisions in existing lease agreements, or where there are disagreements over who should pay costs based on the source of a particular safety defect, is likely to be substantive and problematic. This might result in crucial remediation and even interim measures to protect residents being delayed. I therefore hope that these amendments will not go to a vote.
I've received a single request to speak or to ask a question after the Minister. So, Lord Adonis, it's you.
My Lord, the Minister didn't comment on the Bishop of St Alban's figures, which I think struck the House as of great concern. He said that average remediation costs could be of the order of £50,000 and £60,000 per leaseholder. Would the Minister comment on those figures?
I will comment. I have seen figures in the order of £50,000, but that's an aggregate figure that contains cladding costs, the estimates that I've seen, and also more historic building safety defects. And it's quite clear that as we bring forward the legislation that's looking at these issues, which would be within the Building Safety Bill, we'll have to continue to conduct a further impact assessment, but I'm aware of the figures that the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans, has presented before the House.
I'd like to now return to the mover, Lord Kennedy of Southwark.
My Lords, I won't speak for long, so I don't want to detain the House. We've had a long debate, but can I thank everyone who's spoken in this debate? We've heard very many powerful speeches with very, very important points, very well made. And can I firstly thank the Noble Lord Greenhouse for his response to my motion A1, and also for the time he's taken to speak to me outside of the chamber, and for the letter he sent me today, which is in addition to the All Peers letter. And the letter does set out some clear commitments from the government, and also gives a plan on what the government are proposing, and most importantly, a timetable for action. And I do welcome that very, very much. And I listened carefully to contributions from all Noble Lords. I think I agree with nearly every contribution I've heard today. I would say that I do hear the points made by the Noble Earl of Lytton has made, and it may be that he is right in terms of the points here, but I do think it is our job in this House to press the government to do the right thing by the people of this country. As the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of London said, it's our job to ask them to do the right thing. And I also thank my noble friend Lord Adonis for his support, and I thought the Noble Lord made some very valid points in the general sense about how we deal with matters from the other place, I think in general points, and also specific to this bill as well. I listened also carefully to the Noble Lord Greenhouse, and his response to his motion B, which I said all they relied on the other end was privilege. Now, I actually thought his response was actually very fair. I can see the point he's making. It's a shame the other House didn't do that, just relying on privilege. I mean, I thought it was a very fair point the Noble Lord made there. I must say, I hadn't quite thought of that beforehand, so I do accept that point. What we're trying to do here, of course, on that motion particularly, is ensure that the residents, the tenants have the transparency, the fire authorities, the fire brigade have the... and that's where we need to shine the light on. So it actually may well be that the Noble, we can get there on those points, but I think, it's a shame the other place didn't do that. I do, though, sometimes think that when the government have words like, we have an ambitious programme, or we're striving ahead, and frankly, you've been really, really slow on this, and everyone is really frustrated with the government about this. As my friend Lord Adonis said, 3 years and 9 months since the fire, and this is the first bit of legislation. Now, it is slow, it's frustratingly slow, and I would say to Noble Lord, when he goes back to the department, if he can talk to the Prime Minister, these issues will not go away, and we will not keep raising them until we get some action, proper action here. You've made some commitments today, and that's good, but it's only a start. But this House will hold you to account on these, because you've been frustratingly slow so far. But having said that, I'm pleased we've got so far today, and so I've got enough to draw my motion A1, but I do hope the Reverend Prelate will move his motion to the vote.